the parable of the prodigal son. Um, I'm going to talk in just a few minutes about uh, consideration of a name change, because I don't think that really does justice to the parable. And I want to suggest uh, another name for this parable. But what I'd like to do is to begin by talking about maybe some of the feelings that you and I have that are going to play into this parable that Jesus told in the 15th chapter of Luke. Um, this is a parable about justice and grace. It's a parable about repentance, and it's a parable about forgiveness. Now, oftentimes when we think about those things, we think about, for example, grace and justice as being opposite ends of the spectrum. What I want to do, though, is really to talk a little bit about how all of these things fit together in this parable that Jesus told. Much of the time, you and I live in a kind of either or rather than a both and type of world. Even in the biblical world, it's kind of either or, Pharisee or publican, Jew or Gentile, saint or sinner. So we have these kinds of things that we separate. And one of the things I think we need to do, and I want to talk about this in a few minutes with you, is to sort of bring these back together. Because while we talk about this parable as being a parable about justice and grace, I see those things as fitting together, not as opposites. I see forgiveness and repentance as fitting together as they do in this story. A second thing that I want us to think about is kind of a theological question. At least I'm going to frame it as a theological question. And that is, can you remember a time in your life when somebody hurt you, or you felt resentment, or somebody did something or said something to you, and you never asked for forgiveness for what they did or for what they said, and you keep that in your life? It's sort of like going out to the backyard, figuratively speaking, and picking up the rock and looking at the snake under the rock every day. Some of us have been hurt in our lives. Some of us have felt and do feel resentment. Can we come to the place in our lives where we're able to find some kind of spiritual antidote to that? Because probably nothing more destructive than for you and me to dwell on something that we think has been done to us that is unfair or unjust. The third question that I want us to think about, and maybe we'll talk about these in a little bit, is let's bring it home to our church, to Faith Baptist. This is not to imply that we aren't already many of these things. But it seems to me that people in a church always need to be asking the question, how can we be more compassionate? How can we be more forgiving? How can we be more inclusive in terms of our connections with other people? And even with people in the church, as well as people outside the church. For example, thinking outside the church, are there places that you and I can think about that we could exercise more compassion and share more of the love of God? Inside of the church, do you ever have the feeling that there may be people who don't really feel as much a part of the church as maybe you and I do, and are looking for that kind of care and inclusion and compassion? I think particularly in the day in which we live, how important it is for you and me to stay connected to each other. Because not only are we facing something in terms of the pandemic, but probably each of us is facing some things in our lives that others may not know about. And we don't normally share those things with other people. And yet there's a deep yearning in our lives for compassion from others, for attention, for care. So I want us just to think about some questions like that as we go to this parable. It's interesting that the parable, I'm not going to give it a name yet, but this parable is found only in the Gospel of Luke. Probably there is no other parable that is better known, maybe the parable of the Good Samaritan, but this parable of what we traditionally have called the prodigal son, there's probably no other parable in the Bible that is more well known to us. And yet, interestingly, it is found only in the Gospel of Luke. That raises the question of, where does Luke get this story? And Matthew and Mark, the other synoptic gospels, don't have this story at all. If you and I look at the way that the New Testament is put together, we will discover that most scholars believe that Mark was the very first gospel that was written. We don't know exactly when it was. We think probably somewhere around 65 to 70 CE. Most of the other synoptic gospels follow what we call the Markan spine. Now, it doesn't mean that the other gospels have all of the stories in it. For example, Mark has nothing about the birth story that Matthew and Luke have, but there is kind of a Markan spine that the other gospels also follow to a great extent. But that brings up the question, if Mark doesn't have the parable of this prodigal son, why does Luke have it? Well, we know that there were other sources for the Gospels that the Gospel writers and their communities followed. One of them is what is called by scholars the Q source. Simply the German word Quelle, we call it the Q source, And we find some things in each of the Gospels that are not found in any of the other Gospels that may come from the Q source. Now, I wish we had the Q source. We don't have it. So we just have to assume that some of the things that are in, for example, one Gospel may have come from this source that we don't have that is called the Q source. Another thing we need to remember is that each of the Gospels has its own source, what we would call in Luke the L source for Luke. Luke is put together in a way that is different. It has the mark and spine, but it is put together in a way that is different from the other Gospels. And a lot of it has to do with the community of Luke, the community that surrounded Luke, and what Luke felt that that community of faith needed to hear. We think Luke and Matthew were written sometime 75 to 85 CE. John's Gospel, which is not synoptic, it is not a synopsis of Jesus' life. It is more of a theological look at Jesus' life. Probably the last Gospel that was written somewhere around 90 CE. But that's the reason that, for example, we turn to Luke and we see this wonderful parable that most of us who have grown up in church have come to know as either the most significant parable or certainly one of the two most significant parables, but only found in the Gospel of Luke. One of the things that we need to ask ourselves as we look at this story, before we actually get to the story itself, is there is probably no parable that Jesus tells that is more developed than this parable. If you're going to look at a story and you're going to ask, is it well developed? You start looking at things like, what is the plot of the story? Is the plot clear? You start looking at things like, who are the characters in the story? Usually we look at the fact that ordinarily in the parables that Jesus told, there are only two characters who are on the stage at the same time. That's true for this parable. There are three primary characters in the parable, the two sons and the father, but the three of them never appear on the stage at the same time. Luke is powerful in developing stories in what I call an economy of words. You don't read the parables of Luke and say to yourself, Luke starts out and he says this, and by the way, and then we're down another road. Luke tells stories in such a way that they are so well plotted that you and I can follow the stories and remember the basic components of those stories. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about why parables? Why doesn't Jesus just say what he wants to say without going into stories, which may confuse some people? The issue is that you and I remember the stories better than we remember a list of propositions. It's the same thing in teaching and in preaching. You and I are apt to walk away from a sermon, and I want to tell you, I have to say parenthetically, This really used to bother me when I was a young pastor, because I had gone to seminary and we had studied all of this wonderful theology and biblical knowledge and all of that. And maybe I would put a story into a sermon, and a month later, somebody would come up to me and say, whatever happened to that little boy and his dog that were on the ice floe that you were talking about? And I would think to myself, I could have found that story without ever going to seminary. And yet a month later, she's at the door, not asking about the Trinity, not asking about salvation, not asking about any of the stuff that we think about theology. What she's asking about is, tell me again about that story. So you and I, as we tell the stories of our lives, or as we dream, or as we share with each other, usually do it in terms of stories. The closer I want to get to you, the more apt I am to share my life in stories. The more distant I want to get from you, the more I'm likely to share my life in terms of propositions. I can tell you where I was born, when I was born, but having that kind of information is really not going to give you much of who I am. If you and I sat down one day and we said, you know, we need to share, we want to share with each other some really deep things in our lives. We want to share some places where we've been that have really been hurtful to us. We want to share some losses that we've had in our lives. We want to share some dreams that we once had that suddenly turned into nightmares. When we start sharing at that level, we start sharing in stories, and I learned something about the story of your life, and you learned something about the story of my life. It's not information. About 150 years ago, there was an essayist by the name of De Quincey who wrote about what he called the language of knowledge and the language of power. De Quincey said, the language of knowledge is like reading a cookbook. You can read the ingredients and how much go into it, but it simply is the language of knowledge. The language of power is when you and I begin to share at the deepest level of our lives. And we do that when we listen to some of the parables of Jesus, and we begin to see Jesus, who is behind all of these parables. So I want to talk about, there was a certain man who had two sons. Let me give you a different name to the parable. I mean, this is not life or death, but I do want to give you what I think is a better name. The central figure in this parable is the father. It is the father who goes out to both sons. It is the father who extends grace to both sons. It is the father who is the forgiving one in the son, in the story. Certainly, there is the younger son who came to his father and said one day, I want my part of the inheritance. If you were the younger son, that meant you got 1/3 of the inheritance. The father said, I'm going to give it to you, but do you know really what the younger son was saying in asking for his inheritance? He basically was saying, I wish you were dead. But the father gave his inheritance, went to the far country, spent all of his money and substance that the father had given to him. A famine came to the country. The younger son had nothing to eat. He went out to work for a person with feeding the pigs. Now, right there, we get a jolt. Because for a Jewish person to be connected and to be feeding the pigs is like being a Gentile. It's like surrendering the rights that we read about in terms of the dietary laws. A good Jewish person will not eat country ham, sausage, bacon, anything to do with a pig. For this son, it was like giving up the covenant, giving up the old covenant. He said to himself, interesting, a beautiful phrase, he came to himself when he was in the far country. I love that phrase because I really don't know all that that means. What does it mean for you and me to come to ourselves? Does it mean that we realize how desperately we need something that we don't have, that we have to get from God? I think that has a lot to do with it. Does it mean that suddenly this younger son realized that he couldn't do life by himself? I'll go back home and I'll tell my father that I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I want you just to hire me as one of your hired servants because at least they have enough bread to eat. He practiced his words of repentance before he got home. The problem is he never got to finish when he got home. The father saw him afar off. Beautiful phrase. Sometime read the Bible and see how many times the phrase afar off is used. When Jesus is being crucified, we're told that the women who followed Jesus were watching him from afar off. I had a student who did a sermon about seeing Jesus from afar off. the father ran to his son, which a father would never do that. That just wasn't what a father would do. But he was so delighted to see his son that he ran to his son and kissed him, and then brought him home and said, the ring, the robe, the sandals, and kill the fatted calf. I could understand the story better, I think, with a sense of justice, if the father had said, bring some bread and water, bring some sackcloth and ashes. My son has broken my heart. But when he said a robe, the robe was a way of saying, this is my son. And suddenly everything begins to change. The celebration. Now we suddenly shift. See, those two characters are on stage together. Now we go out to the field where there is the son who apparently lives life in a very just way. I mean, everything in this elder son's way of thinking has to be fair. If you get something, you have to deserve it. A ring and a robe and sandals and fatted calf. I mean, if you had been the next door neighbor to this father, would you have gone to the party knowing how much that this younger son had broken the father's heart? But what is the response? The response is grace, which is simply unconditional love. The elder son is starting toward the house and he hears the music and dancing. You know, some people really can't stand music and dancing. They like it much better in sackcloth and ashes. What's going on at the house? And the servant says, here's what he says. This brother of yours has come home and your father has killed the fatted calf and they're having a celebration. The older son becomes angry because if you and I live life by everything is fair and just, and we're treated the way that we live without any mistakes, we're going to live our lives being resentful of anybody who gets something that we think they don't deserve. Do you know the father not only came out to the younger son, and this is why I like the title, The Parable of the Loving Father. This father goes out to both sons. The parable begins, there was a certain man who had two sons. He goes out to see his son. And the older son, instead of saying, this brother of mine has come home, do you know what he says? You can feel the anger. When this son of yours comes home, And then he looks at his father and he says, listen. And there's an exclamation point after listen. It's like, listen, old man, listen. I've spent my whole life serving you and doing what you've wanted me to do. And he tells his father how unhappy he is. How does the father respond? Everything I've ever had is yours. Everything that I've ever had has been yours. Why didn't he realize this? Why don't I sometimes in my life realize this? Why do I let something like resentment or life isn't fair, or if things were just, I would be the one who would be getting the party? He can't hear, because sometimes when you and I are so angry with resentment as he was, you and I simply can't hear. Everything I've ever had is yours. Now here's, again, one of the jolts of this story, and here's one of the claims. I've talked about when you and I read a parable, we're going to read the story, the details of the story, but we're going to ask ourselves, where am I in this parable? What is the claim that it's making on my life? The older son, we never know from the biblical story how he responded to his father. It's what our friend Fred Craddock calls inductive preaching. It's where you give people just enough that they can complete the story. Do you think that he ever came in for the celebration? Because a good story always is a story that turns it over to you and me. And that's where we have to ask the question. The question really isn't whether the older son ever came home and understood the grace of his father and the love that his father had for him. The claim of this story is whether I and you ever realize that, and whether we're able to put aside whatever feelings we may have that really keep us from claiming the graciousness of God. I mentioned to you before, but I think this is so important. The Greek word for grace is charis, C-H-A-R-I-S, put into English. Do you know what the word for thank you is in the Greek? C-H-A-R-I-S. The real mark of grace is when you and I become gracious people. Now that's the story. And I suppose I have to ask myself, where am I in this story? Frankly, I can identify more with the older son than I can with the younger son. I never remember a time in my life when I slammed the screen door on my parents' values and said, "Give me my stuff, I'm leaving." But I can remember times when I haven't been able to let something go. And I've not been able to get in on the celebration. Because this is what a parable is about. This parable: grace, forgiveness, joy, and celebration. Okay, let me turn it over to you and see what you